Deepa, how's it going?
I'm great. I'm excited to be here and have a conversation with you.
Yes, and welcome to the Mitchell Report Unleashed podcast. And such a conversation we're about to get into when it comes down to diversity, people of color,
Yes.
and really just understanding our ways through life, how to navigate, and things like that. Let's get into you and your story a little bit. How has growing up in the world affected you to make you become the person that you are today?
Yeah, so I grew up on the East Coast in New Jersey, in a very small farm country town. We had like one stoplight, no, like we got a McDonald's, I think, about 5 years ago, and it was like the biggest event in town. There was a general store, so just kind of give you a sense of the town. Grew up across the street from a cornfield. And I was one of only five students of color in school, a 500-person school. I mean, of any color, right? And I think there was a lot of confusion for me around identity. My parents immigrated from India in the late 60s. My father and I are darker skinned. My mother and my sister are very light skinned. And so even some confusion when we would go out on, are you all one family or where are they from, And but at the same time, these weren't necessarily conversations we had at home. So race wasn't really talked about that much. And so for me, there was a lot of confusion. I think there was probably a lot of shame and pain that, I understand now, but at the time I didn't really understand. And a lot of navigating white spaces, to be honest with you. And that happened when I was young. It happened in high school, then happened I went to a lot of very elite, prestigious, universities and all those the degrees. But even in those spaces, I was often and only without understanding that. And so I think this sense of lack of belonging, and who am I in the world, and what does it mean to be an Indian woman, right? Because again, growing up, there was none of me anywhere represented on television and magazines. I never saw myself, and so a lot of confusion around what it meant.
Yeah. So, what was one of the biggest things that you had to overcome as far as adversity that you could give back to the audience that maybe growing up in this world, different religion, different background, different shapes,
Yeah.
sizes, and things like that?
Yeah, for me, when people ask me about my childhood or growing up, like one of the biggest incidents for me is my parents did really well as immigrants coming here. My dad started his own business and got into real estate. When I was in high school, the real estate market crashed, and so he lost everything. Went into bankruptcy. We didn't really know how we are going to pay bills. He got really sick. Like a lot of things happened in short order, and I was the oldest of two girls. My mother had never worked outside the home at that point. And so I stepped into a lot of sort of responsibility early. I remember, 13, 14, dealing with lawyers and bankers and trying to figure out what was going to happen. And so I think there was a lot of growing up quickly around that. So even like things like money and class and things that I might not have been exposed to in a different setting, like really came up early for me. And a sense of security, right? That financial security can go in a heartbeat. And so I wanted a different sense of security. But one of the stories that I remember really clearly was it got really bad at one point. And so my parents filed for bankruptcy and went to go ask for public assistance for a little bit. I remember being in line, and I tell the story in the book that I wrote, but there's a woman behind a plexiglass, thing, which I don't know why maybe she didn't care, but I guess she's thinking like we can't hear her, right? Because she's behind this plexiglass, even though it's just, like 2 feet long. And she says, Martha or whoever she's talking to, can you believe we have people showing up here with names we can't even pronounce asking for help? And I remember being behind my father and just shrinking and feeling like, you know, a lot of things, right? I've never even really talked about unpacking it, but shame, confusion. What is that about? Like that felt like a different kind of overt racism. There was always a racism of what are you, going over to my friends' houses, right? Like again, like their parents always had feelings about, what I was or where we came from. Lots of questions all the time. But that incident was really, I think, marked into me and really made me want to pursue policy or do politics. That's where I thought I was going to go. I ended up in corporate, so I didn't do that. But really wanting to focus on social change and like what's going on here, because that feeling I don't want anyone else to have.
Yeah. It kind of, just what you said, it resonates. It's landing.
Yeah.
And it's like, I've been through the exact same. I think all the audience members that are minority, like I say, different shapes, sizes, we talk about diversity and inclusion, have all been through something of discrimination comes in all different realms. And I go back to growing up in school here in Canada and getting the N bomb called and being pushed in lockers and having your your hat that your aunt and your uncle buy that they take back from Michigan to bring here to give to you, and it gets roofed, and you get your basketball kicked down the hill, and it's go
Yeah.
fetch, all the names and things
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
And it actually plays on the trauma situations, what I
Yeah.
mean, that we face.
Yeah.
Let's spin it like this. We're both grown adults.
Yeah.
The millennials, they may experience
Yeah.
some of this. They have
Yeah.
social media. They've got bullying.
Yeah.
They've got all of these different pillars to turn to. Where do you think the disconnect as far as them finding who they are in this space of diversity and inclusion growing up in this world?
First, I just want to say something with the story you shared. I think that it's interesting, because I've talked to a lot of women, as I've done research and did research for the book. I do think it's in some ways different, the experience of being a color. Obviously, it's totally different if you're Indian versus Black, or everyone's going to have their own experience. But it's really interesting because my husband is Sri Lankan, very dark skinned, grew up in Australia, and can tell similar stories to what you just described. Like he went through a lot of that. So I do think for me it showed up more, just to name this, because I don't know if you've ever talked, in dating. Like it showed up more when I would go to someone's house, like friends, or oh, you're dating her, like the acceptability of what I was. That's how it showed up for me. So it wasn't as violent, or it wasn't as in my face, but it would be that sort of acceptability where I felt it even at 12, 13, 14. And so that's when it really started to be more of an issue for me and something I internalized. I think for this next generation, I think identity is just something, if you talk to people, they'll say like identity is just, it's just different, right? Like the issues that I grew up around identity, at least they feel like they're different. Like there's less barriers, there's less focus on it. It's more about experiences and how you show up and who you are than what you are. But I think the disconnect sometimes is there's still people looking at you and judging you for what they carry and what they are. And so even though you see yourself a certain way, you can still navigate spaces and experience things that are really confusing if you don't understand them and don't talk about them. And so I think social media is wonderful in that it helps you talk about some of these things, and so you can get it off your chest. But I think in some ways, I focus a lot of my work is on workplaces, right? And so a lot of young women will come to me and say, well, that's not going to happen to me. And they'll call me a year later, and it's of course happened to them. But I think there's a little bit of disconnect, right? Or confusion over how you see yourself as the most important thing, but you can experience a lot in because of how other people grew up and what other people carry that I don't think a lot of us are prepared for. Like that's the most shocking thing to me is regardless of who I interview and who I talk to, it felt like most of us weren't well prepared on how to handle racism outside of the home. Like there wasn't even in the families where it's talked about all the time, they never talked about it at work, or they never said like what you should do in the moment. And so it was like no matter what you've been equipped with, it's just a hard thing when you're confronted with it.
Yeah. And I want to unpack and then go into a different direction here because we're going to talk about the
Yeah.
workplace. But you mentioned about dating, and it's like when you go meet those parents and it's a different color of skin. I believe in interracial relationships for everybody that knows me. And it's like you meet the white families, and when you get to go over, it's always that look, And I always say to
Mm-hmm.
myself, I'm like, are you looking at me because I'm 6'4" and I'm tall and I'm athletically built? Or are you looking at me because it's the color of my skin? And you see it because you can see it, you can feel it, the energy shifts. Could be the man,
Mm-hmm.
could be the woman, could be the dad, could be the mom. Oh, and I'm just like in the back of my mind, yep, here we go. Yeah, it's time. And it
Yeah.
makes you feel a way. But when you
Yeah.
open your mouth, and I always say is
Yeah.
this, sometimes when you open your mouth and you come from an educated background, it's like, it's funny how people then treat you because they're like, oh, wait, he's actually articulate. He can actually speak. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? And things like that. And you surprise a lot of people. It's the same thing even in the
Mm-hmm.
workplace. You walk into these
Mm-hmm.
workplaces,
Yes.
I see 2020. I'm in the corporate world still, but I think businesses really started to get into this, push the agenda now. And I'm like, as us on the
Mm-hmm.
outside looking in, we're like, I get it, but it's now because we're marching in the streets for Black Lives Matter. Now because we're talking about this at our dinner tables, in our barbershops, in our grocery stores, in our social gathering groups on patios. Now we want to start talking about it. It's something that should have been already talked about. What did Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and all the men and women of power, civil rights power, are looking to do. Bring to the attention of what's going on today. So, how do you feel it's going right now in your personal expertise in the workplace, in the corporate workplaces? Before you get into this powerful content and this conversation, I need you all to do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button on the channel, because that's the best way you're going to stay up to date with everything that's going on. Like, share, comment, review, and let me know what's going on, people.
I have a lot of mixed feelings about how things are going. So, again, my focus is a lot on the workplace. And so I find it really hard in what you were describing. It's almost as if prior to 2020, there was a completely different conversation about race at work, right? I think there may have been some and I say some, like, and I'm choosing my words carefully. I feel like there wasn't maybe there was mostly universal agreement. Racism happens, right, in the world, different varying degrees to how much it affects people. And I think a real lack of understanding of how it shows up, especially in America for Black Americans, but I mean, in general, right? And I feel like, but the conversation about happening at work was in complete denial. Like prior to 2020, when you talked about racism at work, people would look at me and just say, it doesn't exist. We don't even know what you're talking about. Workplaces are a meritocracy. If you just, work hard, it'll all be fine. And my work is completely based on literally undoing that sentence. The workplace is not a meritocracy. It shows up differently for different people. How I think we're doing, this summer is hard. If you had asked me that question, a few months ago, I was feeling optimistic. My book came out in March. And so as a result of that, I've just been doing hundreds of talks at companies and in different places. And I see a desire for a conversation I've never heard before, and an openness in a very different sort of way to the conversation, because I'm sharing a lot of stories of women of color and how the workplace shows up differently for them. And usually, or historically, I have felt like that conversation was really hard, and it felt like there was much more openness. I don't know. I feel like I'm in a moment where I'm trying to find my own bearings. I'll be honest with you. I haven't said that to anybody else on any podcast. I felt very optimistic. I felt very hopeful before. And I'm not saying I'm not hopeful, because I think to do this work, you have to find your optimism, right? Or it's just really hard to continue to do it. But I'm in a moment with everything that's happened around Roe v. Wade here, with everything that's happening as far as the continual shootings, and just kind of everyone I feel like is bracing for another one. I'm trying to find my optimism again. I'm trying to find my standing. I'm trying to make sure, even selfishly or personally, that the work that I do in the world it matters. It's important. It's the right thing to focus on. And so I feel like we've progressed a lot from 2020, but this summer I think is really hard. And if you talk to a lot of, again, I talk to mostly women. If you talk to women and moms, like, it just feels extra hard, almost back to the beginning of COVID, when they were trying to figure out how to school, kids at home and homeschooling. Like, we're almost back there. Like, it feels like people are on empty. I was chatting with one of my girlfriends, and we were saying we normally have a circle of friends where someone's up, right? Like it's a circle. And so, if you're down, you can get energy from somebody else. And it's almost like a relay race, she was saying. And I loved that concept, right? Like, when I'm really low, I'll just hand the baton and someone will take the next leg for me. And she was like, Deepa, none of our friends have anything left right now to take the baton, And so I just think we're in that collective moment. That's what I'm sensing. I think the recession, also, I worry that this work in particular, and initiatives around diversity and inclusion, what's going to happen as people start to make cuts, or the recession hits. These can't be the first roles to go, or the first budgets to cut. And so I'm hopeful, but I'm taking a beat. I'm taking it next week off to try and just reset myself, because it's been a hard summer.
It has, and I think even here in Canada, and prior to us recording this, there's a lot that is really surfacing again, even with life and death. And you look at family, friends passing away. You look at friends passing away. And it's for us to realign our focus. And I feel like we're so distracted in this world when it comes down to, it could be social media, it could be building our brands, building our businesses, all of this stuff. Yes, we're supposed to do that, but we're missing that ingredient of called inclusion with each other, right? And really just checking up on one another. What does that look like? What does that feel like? You know what I mean? It's not all
connectivity, I think.
And I think that the way we got to connect it all starts with us men and women, right? And I think
Mhm.
about inclusivity amongst men treating women in the workplace.
Mhm.
What is three things men that are listening to this can take back to their workplace, right? Take back to the corporate world, take back to
Yeah.
even entrepreneurship to make women feel
Yeah.
safe in their respective roles.
Yeah. Um, so many things to say. I really believe in, again, a lot of what I do research on is the structural disconnects, right? So I think so much of what we have told people is you have to work harder, you have to do more, women, you have to, assimilate or conform or give up parts of yourself and act like the men that have come before you if you want to rise, right? That's a lot of, and that's a really hard message. And so my work is really showing people that the structure and the systems need to be remade. With that said, I do think that there are things that people can do. And I think one is we can't make change without men being part of the conversation. So, I really try and make sure, especially when I am in a room of white men, that, my work is not about taking power from you and giving it to the people who look like me, right? It's not about that. It's about actually making the pie bigger. And so I think the most important thing we can do around inclusion is not make people feel like it's taking and giving, and really changing that conversation around scarcity of resources. So that's one. I think the second is really listening to women, and asking more questions and really listening in a different way, because our experience is different in the workplace. There are extra burdens, extra challenges, extra roles, extra work, extra discrimination, and things that we encounter as a result of being women or women of color in the workplace that are different and unique, and that you can help make better if you're just aware of it, if you just ask, if you just pay more attention. Whether that is being talked over in meetings, whether that is not being, asked or given an opportunity, whether that's being labeled noisy or aggressive or, too ambitious. Those things you can make a difference on. And then the third is, one of my favorite ally stories is a white male tech executive who said to me, I own my company so I can do this, but he'll walk into a meeting. And if the meeting is all of his white male manager leaders, he'll walk out and he'll say, I want who's in the room to look like the company, or I want who's in the room to look like the client we're serving. Like, I don't want to talk to six of you. Why are you the ones that are showing up to present the ideas to me? And he walks with his feet. And so I think sometimes we will say, we'll wait for the next meeting or wait for the next incident or we'll address it next time. And I love that example of he just walks out every single time and says, you got to do better, and you got to do better now, not, 3 months from now. And so I think it's those three things. And I think sometimes it's just small acts, right, in the moment. I do a lot of work with allies. And one of the things that I say is, I teach women of color, first of all, to speak up in the moment when a microaggression or racist incident happens, because I think most often we're not taught what to say. And so in the moment, we just are caught flat footed or, step back because we're in the pain and shame. But I'm starting to teach allies what to say in that moment, right? So you can say something like, what was just said might really offend Deepa. Like, I just want to check in with her. Can we pause the meeting, like, so we can unpack what was just said? Because I'm watching Deepa's face and I just want to make sure she's okay. Or what you just said doesn't make me comfortable. I'm not sure everybody else in the room is feeling that way, but I just need to ask a question. Like, it's not just my responsibility when something like that happens to take action, it's everybody's. And I think that's where we sometimes fall short. We look at the person who we think is offended and expect them to speak up. But in those moments, I'm being back to being that little girl, with watching the plexiglass, like wondering, like, did that just really happen? What do I do there? So,
Yeah. And you're starting to see, and well said, well said. That's a masterclass right there. Just in that little piece right there.
mm,
You see the diversity and inclusion happening in the corporate worlds and sports and things like that. And, women coaches, assistant coaches. You're seeing them referee games now in basketball and things like that, NFL. And I still think that the ego meter of some of these men in the corporate world, I'm talking about those guys that are
mhm,
over 200K and so on and so on and
mhm,
so on, still have this, you know what I mean? I know this may come back to bite me. I look at one particular chairman of professional wrestling, Vince McMahon, and I say to myself, is the derogatory things that he's been faced with. Now, I'm not looking for the viral clickbait moment, but I'm like, how much money is too much money that you can't act accordingly to be able to protect women. Now, there's women of color that he's actually kind of, turned his head around, So it was like Sasha Banks, Naomi. And I say to myself is, dude, get a grip. I say men can't keep just flexing that ego button when it comes down to their money and thinking that, oh, it can't come back to haunt them. I always say is anytime you have a time of or a place of influence and power, use that to bring other people up, not bring them up for your own sexual, physical connotations or whatever it is you're wanting to do. So when you see these things happening with these athletes and these men, higher echelons, and seeing women not being protected, what's your take on that?
It's hard. It almost feels like you were asking about the questions of 2020. Like I felt like there was a moment where we're making a lot of progress around Me Too, and we were hearing more stories, right? I mean, I think part of what you're putting words to is that we're not talking about things that are new. We're talking about things that have happened for centuries, decades, right? And they've just been ignored or accepted, or that was just the cost of doing business. And I think we've had these inflection points, right, around 2020 and racism, right, around Me Too. But how do those things become ingrained in the culture? How do those become the new norms? I think is what I struggle with, right? Versus like it's a 2-year sort of focus and then we're going to move on to the next thing, or the recession has come, so we're not going to focus on those things. So yeah, I worry. We don't protect women. We don't protect women of color. We don't have, a lot of, I have a line in what I wrote that sometimes people pull out where I say, a lot of the company processes are set up to protect companies, like HR processes and reporting processes. They're set up to protect legally, like to protect the company. And that if you actually speak about an indiscretion or harassment, there's actually backlash to that. And I found that over and over and over again in the women I spoke to. So it's, you have the perpetrator, but I guess what I'm sharing is the system also doesn't protect the women when they do speak up. And so there's not really always a reward for speaking up. There's actually, you're almost traumatized a second time when you speak up. And so I want to see the men held accountable, but I also want to see the processes change so that more women can come forward and that we don't re-victimize them when they come forward and talk about what's happened to them.
Well said. And it's out there. You know what I mean? You see this whole high value male status thing, and you agree to disagree to those points. I'm not saying you personally, but the audience that are listening. And then I spin it back and I'm like, well, you got to be careful here, because yes, you can be a person of value, but that doesn't mean your power is there to be enlisted to stomp on people for you to do whatever it is you want to do, because they're going to come for you regardless of the matter, right? You speak about the Me Too movement, the feminist movement, all of these different movements and things like that. And I'm just like, hey, listen, can we just all play in the sandbox with the sand and the
but
sets?
for me, the bigger conversation that we're not having around all that is power, right? Basically, I feel like power has been set up in a certain way that is exploitative. It's top down, right? It's based in, at least in America, it's based on enslavement principles, right? It's based on all this history. And I even with the women I work with, right? Like a lot of us end up wanting to climb without really understanding, like, what are our values? Who are we? As we climb, can we beat ourselves? Or are we kind of emulating what has come before us? And so part of what for me is interesting, what you're asking is more like, why is that powerful? Why is that respected? Like, how do we start to redefine power? So that's not what more little boys or people are aspiring to. Even young girls, like that's power. Like I want to own an airplane. I want to fly around. I want to be CEO of a company. No, I want to be CEO of a company because I can affect people. I can use my money for good, or I can affect social change, or I can address racism, whatever that is. How do we start to connect those things more? And I'm seeing it a little bit more in the next generation, but that's the disconnect. Like there's a point where I think we've been taught to strive for power and success, just to strive for power and success. And that's what I feel like for a lot of people in the last few years with COVID and working from home and all these questions about the space work takes in our life. That's what it's unpacked for some people. Like, what are the values we want to have as a society anymore? Like, what are we teaching our boys? What are we teaching our girls? What does power and success look like? And how do we start to rewrite those things? Because that's where it starts, or that's the bigger conversation, right? Yes, we need individuals to behave better, but I also think we need to really be asking ourselves, what are we trying to do? Like, where are we in the world, and how much more can we act like this?
I think some people are blinded by the the number of followers and what that influencer is doing, you know, yeah, they live a comfortable life, but having a yacht, having a boat, an airplane is just things at the end of the
Yeah.
day. It doesn't make or break you. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Oh, because you can have a yacht party. Okay, cool. You know, somebody, I forget who it was on social media, leaked out the information that even people that fly on these private planes is actually not a private plane. They're actually like in an office setting that looks like a plane.
Yeah.
So it's like pick your choose your battles. You know what I mean, and things like that. But for me, there's just so much that's just there, and I feel like us as me as a black man, you of being of Indian descent is what we have to do. Have these conversations. That's why we're on this podcast, because the audience can listen. More conscious
Yeah.
conversations, more dialogue. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think men, and I'm gonna speak to men on this here, lower that ego bar down and don't think because you're in a professional setting or a professional system means you can simply sit here and take what you want from these women, because you can't.
Yeah.
Because it's gonna come back and it's gonna bite you in the derriere. You know what I mean? And that's the reason why when I see these guys now getting canceled, I'm like, well, guess what? That's the thing. You can have all the talking points you want, agree to disagree, but actually going out and getting involved in all these different misconducts, come on now. Smarten up.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I ask you this. In America right now, you speak of everything that's going on, the shootings, right? Racism is still here. It's alive. It's over here. It's alive and well. What is something that you're doing in the community, not say outside in the workforce, that's bringing the attention to help, you would say, the younger generation, or even, you know, the males and the females and things like that?
Yeah. So when I left my corporate job in the early stages of COVID. So right before we called it the Great Resignation here, at least. And I left without real clarity around what I was going to go do. Got a lot of feedback that I had to be going to something, right? You can't just leave like a big job. It doesn't make sense. I just knew I was done. It was time for me. I wasn't feeling well. There were a lot of things that had come together on purpose and being sick. And so one was I wrote the book, which I really wrote for like the women coming after me, trying to share stories and trying to almost like the user manual that I wish I had had as a woman of color coming up. Like, what's going to happen to you? What are the encounters you're going to have? So you're not so shocked, because what I find is so often most of us think it's just happening to us or it's just our experience. And collectively sharing that it's a universal experience really allows, again, that pain and shame to go away so that you can freedom in some of it. So that's one, is like I'm hoping and I'm seeing like even people that are just graduating pick up the book and write me a message saying this is really helpful, or I learned this, or this story really resonates. So that's one. The other thing I've done or I'm doing is trying to bring women of color together. So I co-founded Information, which is a company for women of color, and we just have conversations and create safe space to share. Because a lot of what I have found is, and again, I work with more senior women in that organization. Most of us are isolated. We're, in these high power roles, but we're often one of the only, or, the only one in our companies. And so bringing together women once a month and having conversations about what's working, what's not working, how do we support each other? What do we want to do in the world? Are just not conversations that I see happening all the time, right? I think most of us don't have places where we can go and talk about making change. And so that's really where I'm focused right now. And also just, helping women that show up. I think there's a lot of younger women coming up that want to do things differently. And so I try and be helpful when they reach out as much as I can. I just did a Q&A yesterday, just an open Q&A. Anyone could come ask questions. And there were some younger women who were just early in their career that just wanted to share or ask questions. So I think it's just offering what I have and trying to be helpful right now.
Absolutely. The book. The audience wants to know. I want to know. The book. Speak about the book. Speak about the title of the book. What can we get into? What can we sink our teeth into? Is there an audio version? I'm an audiobook guy myself.
Yes,
right? So
there is an audio version. I recorded it myself, so you'll hear me for 6 hours. I interviewed 500 women of color to write it, from all walks of life, all backgrounds, mostly U.S. and Canada based, but all backgrounds. and all industries, all levels. And it started because I was really struggling. I knew, like I said, I knew I wanted to leave my corporate job. I probably spent 3 years longer than I should, trying to figure out if I could leave. I was the first Indian woman we had made partner in the firm of 100,000 people. And so I felt like there were a lot of eyes on me. And so I started meeting with women of color one-on-one just to figure out, like, where do I want to go? What do I want to do? Those conversations turned into about a dozen dinners across the country where I ended up meeting about 300 women of color. They were just literally casual dinners. Like, I'm meeting in New York. Here's an invitation on LinkedIn, or do you know of a friend who'd be great? And, in a networking setting, we get to those conversations. I thought for 1 or 2 hours, 6, 7, 8 hours later, 2, 3, 4 in the morning, we're still talking because we were finishing each other's sentences. And this is prior to 2020, right? So this is before, I think, conversations on race at work happened. And so that became the fodder for the book, or the stories for the book, or the reason for the book and the company. Like, there just felt like there was something happening in the room that was magical, where there is a shared experience for women of color at work that feels different, that we have nowhere to talk about. I also learned in those rooms that I was staying in my company because I felt responsible for staying, right? As a woman of color, I think a lot of us feel like we've sacrificed to get to the seat. So we have to stay, because if we leave, it signals failure for those that come around us. And so I learned a lot of my own process. So the book is stories of all of these women. I did not tell one person's story really deep. I wanted to show the expanse. And I talk about what's different for us, like how there's a job in the job that we get asked to do, how we're highly visible and invisible a lot of the time in the workplace, how it's challenging because some of us come from cultures where women aren't supposed to work outside of the home. And so there's this extra layer of what that means. And also it's how we find community, because I believe we can make change. I believe that we need to change systems, but we can't do it by ourselves. So it's really about the power of me, how you figure out what's important to you, what are your values, because a lot of us just inherit them from our parents or from our culture without really doing our inner work. And then it's about finding the power of we, like finding each other so that we can make change. And so it feels like everything that I'm doing right now is focused on that, but it's been really, I think, rewarding, because what I've found, and it's a lot of the conversation we were having, is that power for a lot of women of color, that concept doesn't resonate. We don't want it. The most common thing I heard in the dinners was, I sit in a seat of power and I don't feel powerful. And here I am sitting with some of the most powerful women in the country, and they're telling me they don't feel powerful. And so that's what I really wanted to understand in the book. And that's really what my work is about now. Like, how do more of us feel powerful? Because if we're getting to the seat and we're broken, that's not a healthy place to be. We can't like make change sitting at the tops of organizations if we're not full. And so that's really what the book is about.
That quote, I sit in the chair and I have power, but I don't feel powerful.
Yeah, I sit in a seat of power and I don't feel powerful.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Elaborate a little bit more onto that.
Yeah, so
flesh that out for the audience.
Yeah, so these women basically are in high-powered roles, and they've had to give up too much of themselves because of that conforming behavior that a lot of workplaces have, right? What is professional? What is executive ready? What does executive presence look like? It doesn't look like you and I, right? Like, I can't tell you, I'm 5'1", so I'm little. So I can't tell you how many times I'd walk into a meeting and I look younger than I am, especially 20 years ago. You would look at me like why are you here? Like, where's the person in charge? You can't possibly be the partner. And so it's really that used to weigh on me. That used to really, every day, 6 times a day, when you're told like you can't possibly be in charge, you start to question, like, what am I doing wrong that I'm not, powerful, or that I don't carry that. But for a lot of women, it's that they've had to give up parts of themselves. They've had to edit themselves. They don't talk about their languages, their culture, what they eat at home, their families. They're not even putting up pictures because they don't even want to acknowledge that they're a mom, maybe, because then people are going to see them as having lives outside of work. And that's not always, helpful in these fast power, corporate settings. And so it's a lot of sacrifice. And so that sentence is really about the fact that more of us have to find ways to bring, I'm not talking about bring your whole self, because that statement, I don't even know what to do with that, right? So my work is not about bring your whole self to work, but it's, you have to bring the parts that matter to you to work, or you're not going to be happy. You're not going to be your best self. And so it's figuring out what that is for you.
Well said. What a powerful conversation.
Thank you.
I want the audience to really just reflect, take notes, right? Check out Deepa. Plug your social media information. And again, plug that book, right? Plug that book. Because I always say is we have to support content creators. Anything you create, if it's a podcast, if it's a book, if it's a clothing line, support it, right? So that's my gift back to you. And I'll
Thank
definitely be
you.
supporting you.
Thank you. Same, same. Thank you for this conversation. Yeah, it felt like a good time to have it. Like it felt more reflective than than a traditional podcast discussion. So thank you.
No, definitely. So where can everybody check out all your social media
Yeah,
information?
so my website's probably the best place to go for everything. So Deepa Puru, DeepaPuru.com. But I'm on Insta. My best place to find me in my stories is LinkedIn, just because it's longer format and I can talk more about work. But everything's there. Even the TED Talks that I've done 2 in the last year. So there's been a lot of work, a lot of hustle. And again, everything I'm doing right now is about women of color. So yes, please come support. Please come find out what the experience is like, and let's work together to change it.
Beautiful. Well said. Well, I appreciate you, and definitely be in touch. And like I said, guys, go support the book. What's the name of the book again?
The first, the few, the only.
Beautiful. All right. Well, I appreciate your time, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much.